And good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from Willow Springs, North Carolina. It is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here in the United States, and I'd like to say a hello to everyone who is in the broadcast. Looks like we have 3 or 4 people here. I'm wondering, do we have Nelisa here in the audience? I'm imagining so. And I wonder if if our friend from Jaipur is here today. If you're here, go ahead and type a hello in the chat bar and let me know how you're doing. It's always great to see an audience here. Um, and yeah, that's fantastic. Cool. I'm assuming my sound is coming through. You can hear me, you can see me. If you're having any problems, go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know how you're doing. Let me see, is everybody doing well? Just to check. Okay, we do have someone here. It's my friend from Jaipur, Sandeep. Very good, sir. Thank you. I hope you are doing well today. It's great to have you. Okay, as long as I know we're live and everybody can hear me, then I'm going to go ahead and get started with this broadcast, okay? And so today, Sandeep, we are asking, oh, and Nelise is here too. We're asking the question, am I evil? A discussion about human nature. Can somebody please tell me, what do you think? Are people born good inherently and the world makes them evil? Or do you think that people are born evil and the world needs to control them? What do you think? Nalisa, Sandeep, I'd be interested in your opinion because that's what we're going to be talking about today. All right. Now, as I suggested to you earlier, all psychological research started out as a philosophical debate. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but there's this thing called the theory of original sin. Sandeep, I don't know if you know much about the Christian faith, but we have this concept which says because Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, ate fruit from the tree of knowledge, all mankind would forever be evil and be born into sin. In our Christian Bible, it says, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, I'm not trying to preach at you today. What I'm suggesting to you is that early Christian texts, where the Christian religious sees mankind as inherently evil. Melissa says that I think we were born both blank slates and then given a designation from our actions. Wow. I believe we were born into sin because of Adam and Eve. Okay, right. These all represent philosophical approaches to human beings. Do we think that they're inherently good? Do we think that they're inherently bad? Or, as David suggests, are we born blank slates? And that's what the purpose of today's lecture is, the next couple of lectures that we're going to talk about. We're going to discuss human nature and trying to come to a consensus about whether or not people are inherently good or inherently evil. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Really what we're talking about when we say this, we are talking about personality. Dave, Melissa, Sandeep, we are talking about personality. Personality is that characteristic style of feeling, thinking, and behaving that makes you and you and you unique and different from everybody else. Now, the reason that psychologists are interested in psychology is because if you understand somebody's personality, then it's easier to understand why people do certain things, right? So that helps us predict people's behavior, and it helps facilitate social interaction. If I know on that Sandeep has a bad temper, I may not ask him a question if I think it might make him angry because I want to avoid that negative interaction. So it allows us to predict the behavior and understand the behavior of other people. It allows us to understand our behavior. I like doing this right now, live streaming to students around the world, Sandeep, because I'm an extroverted kind of person. That's just who I am. And so knowing about personality really allows us to make the world a more predictable place for ourselves and for others. Now, if you look around through the psychology literature on personality, what you're going to find is that they ask several basic questions. One of the things that they talk about is, where does personality come from? If you are an evil person, where does that evil come from? If you are a good person, where does that come from? How does personality develop? What are the basic building blocks and how does it build for good or for bad? There are some psychologists who are interested in developing tests to measure personality. These people are called psychometricians, psycho, mind, metricians, measure. Psychometrics is the branch of psychology that's interested in measuring mental aspects like personality, self-esteem, intelligence, and other things. And you can also ask the question, where does evil come from? Is it inherent in society, or is it something that has occurred in society as an evil, something that we can remove? So there's lots of different things we can think about when we start studying the theory of psychology. Now, I told you we were talking about good versus evil, so I'm going to start out by talking about theories that describe the human being as inherently evil or animalistic, if you will. Probably the first person to really build a theory of personality was a fellow named Sigmund Freud. He is by far not the most important psychologist. He, however, is one of the most famous psychologists. Holy cow, David Daughtry is going to stop us in our tracks by asking that existential question, what is good and evil? Wow. David, that is a very difficult question. I don't know if you've ever read Nietzsche before, Beyond Good and Evil. He actually sits down and asks that very question, David. He says, you know what? Most morality, senses of good and evil, are built on culture, like a religious culture. What is good? Well, this is good because Allah or God or Shri or whoever says that this is good and says this is bad. But is that really the nature of good and bad? In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche goes past these kinds of things and talks about whether or not we can come to a universal description of what really is good, and how that can be differentiated from evil. David, brilliant question. I don't have time to talk about that. So can we start by just saying, treating it axiomatically? Whatever we all think is evil that fits into our 21st century culture, let's think of that, evil and good. Although that is a damn fine question that you should be bringing up, okay? But it's just too large for this class. Let's talk a little bit about Freudian psychology. Freud was a Viennese medical doctor, and he sort of believed that if you really wanted to understand people, you should think about them. He was really impressed by Charles Darwin. You should think about people in terms of biological imperatives. What is built into the system? What is instinctual, if you will? In fact, Sigmund Freud was kind of cool. He said that whatever is instinctual pops out in your mind as a wish. He argued that wishes were the word we use when we're trying to convey an instinct that we have. I sure wish I had some food. I sure wish I had a girlfriend. I sure wish I had. He argued that what a wish is, it's the cognitive description of what we feel is an instinct. And he argued that human beings are fundamentally instinctual, animalistic creatures And you know what animals do? They just try to make themselves happy. They try to satisfy their own needs. Now, if you remember the last couple of weeks, we've talked about behaviorism, we've talked about cognitive psychology, if you remember those, right? But we are way before behaviorism and cognitive psychology come on the scene. This is psychodynamic. This is psychology, one of the first psychological approaches. We're all driven by animalistic needs. And he argued the problem with society is we all have these needs, which are natural and instinctual. Unfortunately, society is not built to fulfill everybody's instinctual needs. There are controls, there are rules, there are pathways that describe things we can do and cannot do. These societal conventions sometimes do not match up with our instinctual drives. And what Sigmund Freud focused on in his therapy was treating rich Viennese women whose sexual desires and other sorts of animalistic desires ran afoul of the very conventional, conservative Victorian society in which they lived. And what he argued is that most of us are living lives of psychological conflict. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about well, let's focus on sex. So let's look at Freud's idea of what your personality is. He says we're all born with an instinctual desire. He gave this the name of the id. Id is German for it, so he called it the it. You have this endless reservoir for sexual and aggressive energy or whatever energy. He thought it was sexual and aggressive. Now, he argued that there is this second structure called the superego. And this is your sense of shame that develops as a result of early experiences with sex in your life. I'm not going to go into details, but Freud thought that 2 and 3 and 4-year-old children had sort of, if you will, the beginnings of sexual urges, and they learned to fear and be really, really embarrassed by these animalistic urges. And he argued that this created a second part of the personality we'll call our conscience, but Freud called the superego. Number one is you're in your superego. Now, if you look at the chart underneath me, what he suggested is that by and large, these two processes are below our awareness. You don't really think about your desires, they just come out in your behaviors. And also, you don't think about your sense of shame, but it controls you. These are preconscious, if you will. Now, he argued what we think of as everyday personality, the people sitting right here in front of me, Sandeep and Elisa, whoever's here in front of me, as you're sitting here, your conscious awareness, your personality is nothing more but a part of your mind trying to negotiate between these two parts of your personality that are at odds. Does that make sense? Right? So you always want something, you always feel guilty about wanting something, and you, the human being, have to learn how to manage these feelings of guilt and shame that occur because you have conflicting needs and desires. Okay? Now, he argued, Sigmund Freud developed his theories in the age of the steam engine, the train. This is before cars were invented, okay? The 1800s. And so Sigmund Freud saw steam trains, and steam trains run on pressure, right? You start a fire, you capture the heat and the steam, and you use it to move the train. Steam trains are run by pressure. Sigmund Freud thought that human beings were run by pressure. This conflict between the id and the superego builds pressure that puts pressure on him. And when he met women who had neurotic problems, he argued it's because they couldn't deal with this overwhelming pressure that was being created in their brain. Think of this psychological pressure as being the air blown in a balloon. And if you keep blowing it and don't ever let the air out, eventually the balloon will pop, the same as a human being's psyche. So what he argued was that the human being used a couple of different strategies to reduce the stress, to reduce the pressure from these conflicts. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever dreamed about something that was embarrassing or something that you desired or something that you were afraid of, right? So maybe you had a relatively romantic dream about your friend's boyfriend or your friend's girlfriend. And maybe you realize that you shouldn't be thinking those things about that person. Maybe you have a dream about somebody coming to get you every night. What Freud argued is that when we dream at night and we dream these scary or erotic or sexy things, what we are doing is we are releasing the energy of these desires. He argued your superego goes to sleep and relaxes, and your id comes out and plays in your imagination. There you go, guilty pleasures, absolutely, Sandeep. And what he argued is that these dreams help relieve this intrapsychic pressure that is coming in our mind. However, sometimes people can't release this enough of this pressure. And he argued in this case, it starts affecting their personality. Okay? And he said that people use these strategies to protect themselves from the anxiety created by this conflict. He called these strategies defense mechanisms. Have you ever heard somebody say you are being defensive? Have you ever accused somebody of being defensive? Do you know what it means when you've ever heard somebody called defensive? Oh, you're being defensive. What that person refers to, even though they don't know it, that is actually a referral to what Freud termed defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are just ways to hide us from this anxiety that we feel. Now, have you ever heard of repressed memories? Repressed memories. Repressed memories are, Freud thought that repressed memories were a form of defense mechanism. Sometimes things are so embarrassing or so traumatic that we choose not to think about them. We choose to forget them. This is sometimes called motivated forgetting. And this occurs because a memory is too painful or anxiety producing. He argued after we forget the original thing that bothers us, we then do some other strategy to sort of make ourselves feel better. So sometimes we may accuse somebody else of the same anxiety that we have. Have any of you ever been accused by a partner of being unfaithful, only to find out that that partner was being unfaithful to you, right? Freud would say that that unfaithful partner's guilt, okay, I feel bad for what I'm doing. They forget that they're guilty about that, but then they start dealing with that anxiety by projecting that same bad behavior out on you. They're projecting that behavior. Have you ever yelled at somebody who didn't do anything wrong because you were mad at another person? If you've done that, you've used displacement. Sometimes I'll have a bad day at work, and my wife will come home and she'll say one little thing, and I'll yell at her as if she did something really bad, when really what I'm doing is I'm yelling at my boss, but I can't yell at my boss, so I displace my anger towards another person. Do you folks understand what I'm talking about? So, according to Freud, human beings are born with these instincts to be animals. However, we learn to control these instincts, okay? These bad instincts. We develop a super ego, a sense of shame from our world. However, this pressure is so strong that we need to get out these negative impulses by dreaming at night, right? Freud thought that people went to sporting events because that was a way for them to get out their aggressive instinct to kill. And if you've ever been to a sporting event and yelled, kill them, smash those guys, destroy the other team, what Freud argued is that we're getting out that energy. Okay, exactly. Melissa, same thing. You hurt somebody, if people, when I'm actually mad at someone else. Exactly. And I feel bad because it's not them, it's someone else I'm upset. Exactly. And we do that. And what Freud found was that these conflicts created a lot of anxiety and neurosis and depression for people. And so, according to Freud, the idea was to make this stuff conscious. If you would bring these problems into the awareness, he could fix these problems, right? So, I don't know if you've ever seen heard of Sigmund Freud, but there's the idea of laying on a couch in a psychologist's office. That's what Freud did. You would come and lay on a couch in his office. He invented that. And you would just talk about whatever came to your mind. And he found that people would inevitably start talking about the conflicts that they had in their life. And this was a form of psychotherapy. Okay? Now, here's the deal. There were lots of other people who believed in conflict, but didn't believe that sex and aggression was the thing that drove people. All right. So Freud thought that we were animals driven by instinctual sexual needs. These other psychodynamic psychologists would argue that human beings have these deep internal needs that have to be met, but they disagreed with Freud that they didn't think it was necessarily sex. Okay, so one of the people I wanted to introduce you to was a fellow named Alfred Adler. He argued that all human beings are born incredibly inferior. You're a helpless little baby. And so all of us have this terrible fear of being helpless. And so we are instinctually driven with the desire to become powerful and strong, no matter what it takes to become powerful. And he argued that sometimes people wouldn't have trouble escaping these feelings of inferiority. Maybe your dad teased you. Maybe you look a little bit funny and the other kids teased you. Maybe you were short like me. Maybe you had some sort of feelings of inferiority, or what Alfred Adler would call an inferiority complex. And some people grow up and they're fighting this sense of inferiority that they've had their entire life. But the person often doesn't know that it's them that feels inferior. They point out at everybody else because they're not aware of it. How do we not take out our feelings on the wrong person, such as if you're mad at your boss and you take it out on your family member? That's a good question. I'll answer that in just a second. Karen Horney was also a colleague of Sigmund Freud's, but she felt that really what people want more than anything else is a need for love and security. Okay? Everybody wants to feel safe. And when you have somebody to hold on to, you have a sense of safety. Have any of you ever met a person who has who is a codependent personality? They can't make any decision without talking to somebody else and getting somebody else's opinion. Do any of you know a friend, male or female, that can never be single? They always have to have a romantic partner, and so they bounce from partner to partner to partner. Some people are built with an overwhelming need for security that they can't fulfill, and so they do crazy things to feel secure. Now, Melissa asks a question: how can we not take out our feelings on the wrong person? I'm going to give you a general answer to that, Melissa, that sort of represents an accurate way of thinking about the psychodynamic approach. All of these approaches say that most people do things because they are unwilling to admit their true feelings. Sometimes I yell at my wife because I got embarrassed at work. And the reason I don't apologize to my wife is because I'd have to tell her that I was embarrassed at work and I took it out on her. I would have to show her my authenticity. I would have to be vulnerable and show her my weakness. Most people don't want to show their weaknesses, Nelisa, and so they are unable to admit these conflicts. You may know in your own mind that you don't feel confident, that maybe you feel a little inferior, maybe you have these desires that drive you. You have these things, and what happens is most people don't want to admit the negative parts of their personality. They try to hide from them, and that's when that occurs. Now, Lisa, so what you need to do, and there's no one strategy for just yelling at people, but what I will tell you, if you try to become more authentic with regard to accepting and being willing to admit and share your weaknesses with other people, you will be less driven by these irrational things and you won't engage in the behaviors accidentally. And when you do, it'll be easy to repair the damage because A, you'll be able to admit what happened, and B, the people who know you will be able to understand that that's just who you are. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. Sandeep says that her cousin can't even go outside with her father, and she is 28. Now I have to ask you, Sandeep. I know you're from Jaipur, India. Are adult females pretty much allowed to walk around by themselves in your culture? And if so, and she can't, then maybe yes, she is one of those people like Karen Horney. Now, here's the weird thing. She may, instead of needing security, she may be so afraid of security that she sticks to her dad because she doesn't want to run the risk of running into an acceptable bonding partner, right? Right? So she hangs out with her dad. He's an inappropriate target, but he prevents an appropriate person, an appropriate romantic target from approaching. Sometimes people bond to another and need that person because they need somebody, and sometimes it's because they're afraid of rejection from other people, right? So, in a sense, what the psychodynamic approach to personality says is that human beings are built with these needs. Call them good or bad depends upon how you define your morality. Let's go back to what David Daughtry said early. I can say that these people are evil. Alfred Adler says people want power. That can be perceived as evil. Sigmund Freud can say some people want sex and violence. You could say that's evil, maybe, maybe not, okay? But in a sense, what these psychodynamic people say is that human beings are driven by these internal, innate needs that don't go away and never, never change. Now, I will tell you, there is a counterpoint that has been suggested in the literature. And Carl Rogers, in the person-centered approach, took the exact opposite point of view. He made this very logical argument. According to Freud, the human being is a bunch of conflicts and can't grow up without sadness and pain and struggle. He argued, why do we think that human development is so twisted? He argued that human development is actually a normal, natural process and that is destined to turn out right. And the only time it doesn't turn out right is when somebody else gets in the way. He argued just like an acorn will grow into an oak tree, just like a corn seed will grow into a corn plant, a human being that is born will grow into a normal human being, right? Trees have leaves. You don't see misshapen trees with no leaves. All trees grow up normally and have beautiful, healthy features. He argued human beings also have this actualizing tendency, he called it. It's in your DNA to grow up to be normal. And he argued that we also have this, that if the same way our body is designed to grow up normally, we have what he called a self-actualizing tendency. Your personality and you are going to develop into exactly the person that you should develop into. as long as nobody messes with you. Okay, so he argued people will always develop a normal, happy personality unless, unless they are treated with what he called conditional positive regard or conditions of worth. Most of the time, the world doesn't say grow into whatever you were born to be. Instead, your mom is telling you you must be a lawyer. Your dad is telling you you must be a man. Your brothers are telling you you must not be chicken. Your teacher is telling you you must be able to do this. And all of these people show you their disappointment when you don't do what they do. They've created a world of conditional positive regard. And so, what he argued is that human beings change their personality just a little bit in order to be accepted by the world. So, there's the Chris that does exactly that feels exactly who he is. And then there's Chris, who became the psychology professor because his mama wanted him to be. Is being a psychology professor truly what I wanted to be? Maybe, but I know that my mom made me want to be that. And so, what he argued is that our real self image starts to differ from our ideal self image. That is, what we want to be to make other people happy. Now, for most people, these two sets of selves don't go too far, and you have what's known as a congruent personality. Okay, but he argued sometimes some people grow up in an environment where people make them feel so bad about who they are that they have to become almost a completely different person. In some worlds where homosexuality is not accepted, you may be homosexual but have to pretend to be heterosexual, right? You may hate school, but your parents love school, so you go to school. Think about how many times you are forced to do things and pretend to be things that are not you to make people happy. If this gets too extreme, you develop an incongruent self image and you become disorganized, and this leads to psychological problems. Now, I will ask you before we move on, how many of you have disappointed somebody in your life? You have a friend, a romantic partner, a mom, a dad, a grandparent. Is there somebody who is disappointed in you? My dad really wanted me to join the U.S. military, but I didn't want to join the military. And he always talks about that. You know, it's kind of a funny story my mom told me before she died. She said that I was born back in 1969 before you could see the sex of the baby, and she wanted her final child to be a girl. And my dad told me that when I was born and my mom found out I was a boy, she cried. Right? Can you imagine? I was supposed to be a girl and I was born a boy, right? Melissa, there you go, family members. And it hurts, right? Because you really, really value those people. But if you change your sense of self too much, then you lose your authentic sense of self. Now, if you watch this there you go. Nice. That's the way to do it, David. Now, if you have time and are interested, you can watch this therapy session with Carl Rogers. He was actually recent enough to have his stuff videotaped. And he goes through a therapeutic session with a lady named Gloria. And the whole point of his therapeutic session is to make her feel like a valued human being. And he never tells her what to do. Instead, he keeps referring her back to the idea of you know the right answer. Whatever you feel is right is going to be the right answer. And his job in therapy is just to give her unconditional positive regard. Whatever you do is going to be fine, and to help her make the decision on her own. Your mom wanted you to be a doctor, but now I'm a government employee now. There you go, Sandeep. And you're probably a great government employee. I bet you're happy and have a job that makes sense to you. But some part deep inside of you, that 14-year-old Sandeep probably feels a little bit embarrassed or bad because they didn't do what mom wanted them to do. And I feel the same way when I think about my family. My mom never would go to a psychologist because she didn't believe in psychology. Again, I have to incorporate that bit of disrespect into my personality. And each and every one of you is going to have to decide how to be an authentic you when the world is trying to tell you to be what they want you to be. When my mother wanted me to be a professional soccer player, right. But the crazy thing is, sports parents in their 12 and 13 and 14-year-old, and actually it even happens earlier here in the United States, 8, 9, and 10, when you're playing travel ball, your parents get so crazy about it that they scream and yell. And when you strike out, or when you miss the goal, or when you don't do something right on the sports field, your parents often explode in negative emotion. And you, as a child, realize that you haven't met their conditions of worth. And so every time on the sports field, every weekend, your parents are making you feel that who you are is not good enough. Sure, I'd love you to be a professional soccer player, but Melissa, your mom, we want our parents to accept us no matter what it is we choose to do. Right. And all parents did, and I did it to my kids too, right? And we can't help it, but it can be damaging. Now, quickly, there are one of the things that psychologists also like to do is measure personality. And we like to do that so that we can begin comparing people. Sometimes we use it to help treat people. One of the foundational approaches to developing personality tests. Have any of you taken a test of personality before? Personality tests. There are two kinds of personality tests in the world, and psychodynamic theory created the first type, which is called the projective test of personality. Now, if you remember, I've been talking about people have these needs and motives and desires that they're not even aware of. With regard to the projective personality test, what the tester does is they give you an ambiguous situation, and then they let you answer and act the way you want to act, and you project your psychological needs, your fears, everything about yourself into that evaluation. And that's what's known as a projective personality test. Probably one of the most famous, the first projective personality test was the Rorschach or the ink blot test. Have any of you ever heard of the ink blot test before? Okay, and so in the ink blot test, it's 10 pictures, black and white and color images, and your job as the test taker is to tell me what it is you see. And then I try to guess your needs and your personality based upon what you talk about. Quickly, I have some people on here right now. What is this picture? Let's see, what is this picture beside me of? Can you tell me what this picture is right here? What does it look like to you? Okay, now check it out. I used to teach in the nursing school. And when I would show this picture to my nursing students, you know what the most common answer was? Okay, Sandeep says a bee. That's a good choice. Or a butterfly with near the head. Absolutely. All my nursing students would say that it was a pelvic girdle. It looks like a pelvic girdle to my and part of the spinal column to my nursing students. Okay, so here's the deal. Each and every one of you kind of sees a different thing, and my job is to try and figure out what your personality is based upon how you answer this test. So this looks like, to me, it looks like two bears playing patty cake, right? Can somebody tell me what this one looks like? This is slide number 3. Okay. And so the idea of the Rorschach test, two people lifting something, absolutely, David. So the idea of the Rorschach test was to give somebody something ambiguous and then let them decide what it was they were looking at. And by doing that, sometimes people will sort of clue you in onto what's in their personality. Now, another type of projective test is what's known as the thematic apperception test. This is the TAT test. And this was developed as a way to measure what we call need for achievement. Need for achievement. And so in the TAT test, what they do is they give you an ambiguous scene and you're asked to tell a story. Okay, so what led up to this scene? What's going to happen next? What are each of these people doing? What are each of these people thinking? And the first test, the first person to do this was a fellow named I forget that, Murray, Charles Murray, who was interested in measuring this thing called need for achievement. You ever notice how some students have to have the best grade in the class or be the fastest runner or have the coolest clothes, and other people don't seem to care as much? That's what we call a need for achievement. And this projective test was developed to measure that psychological need in people. Now, one of the things I'm going to have you do if you come to webinar on Thursday night is we're actually going to take the need for achievement TAT. If you want to take that test, just click on this link, measure your NACH, and that will take you directly to the test I just showed you so that you can measure your need for achievement. Now, some of you are probably saying, well, that's crazy that you can't tell anything about my personality based upon whether or not I call that a bee or a bat or a pelvis. You may be correct. One of the big criticisms of this type of testing style, where you let the person just act in a way and you try to guess their personality, is that a lot of times we're not sure we are accurately or validly measuring the person's personality. Can you really say for sure whether a person is a high achiever or a low achiever simply in how they write a story about two ladies that look like they're sitting in a lab? You know, there are people who argue that they're not valid. And an even more damning problem for these tests is if you ask a person to look at these 10 Rorschach slides and tell you what they see, and then give their answers to two different psychologists, what you will find is that oftentimes those two psychologists will come to a different conclusion about what kind of personality that person has. That's what we would call a reliability problem. Okay? So, there's one branch of psychology that says human beings have these innate needs, for better or for worse. These things drive us. We can't control them. They form our personality, and society helps us control them. There are a set of tests which can allow us to measure these sort of internal needs that people say they have. And one of the approaches that was developed to measure this is the projective personality test. Now, I'd like to compare that with what's known as the self-report test. This is the kind of test that most of you have taken. This is where you get if two people have conflicting personalities, that would also be a problem too, David. That would also argue that our test is not valid or reliable. Great question. You can sort of look at it any number of ways and break it down to measure reliability and validity. In fact, you know what you could do? I could give somebody a test, another test that supposedly measures the personality trait that I think I found to see if it really is there. You sound like a psychometrician, David. You're already asking the critical thinking questions about how you would evaluate the quality of a test. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a thumbs up there. Now, self-report tests are a second type of personality test, and they can be used to measure these motivations as well. And a self-report test is that kind of test where you're asked to read a question and say, hey, Is this something you would do? And you have to give them a number between 1 and 3 or 1 and 5 or 1 and 6, where you use numbers to represent your likelihood of feeling some way, acting some way, or thinking some way, right? And this comes from this idea. And so this is the kind of test that's used in the trait approach. Now, this guy below me, Gordon Allport, is the father of the trait approach. And he was the first person to think about trying to measure individual personality traits like this. Instead of just trying to guess your whole personality, he thought that maybe it was broken down into different kinds of traits. And he had this model where he talked about cardinal traits, central traits, and peripheral traits. That's actually in your textbook. But in a sense, people like him sort of ask these questions. How's everybody like you? That is to say, what are the traits that we need to measure all human beings? And I'm going to show you a test like that in about 2 minutes. We also want personality tests that allow us to differentiate between groups of people. Am I an extrovert or am I an introvert? How are some people like you? And then we want tests that allow us to measure uniquely what is unique about David Daughtry, what's unique about Sandeep, what's unique about Chris Roddenberry that makes us different from everybody. That was sort of the approach of Gordon Allport. And basically in these sort of self-report questions, we say, hey, how do you usually behave? How have you behaved in the past? Or how you would behave in the future? Or there's a test called the adjective checklist. I'll just give you 300 adjectives and let you pick the adjectives that describe you. Now, the cool thing about these tests is I'm not trying to guess your personality. You're telling me your personality using numbers. And I can add these numbers up and I can get averages and standard deviations, and I can find out if you're in the 50th percentile or the 90th percentile or the 10th percentile. So there are lots of advantages in directly asking you, hey, Sandeep, are you an extroverted person? Okay. However, sometimes when you make up a set of questions, it's hard for people to answer those questions. So I might say, hey, do you often hang out near the bathroom when you go to parties? You might say, well, I've never been to a party. I don't know how I would act. Sometimes people don't know how they would respond if you ask them directly. And sometimes, especially when tests are used in court systems, people can lie. I know, keep asking a lot of questions. No, your questions are great, David. Is there a limit to how many traits someone can have, or is there a limit? Brilliant question. No, there is not a limit to the number of traits. In fact, I could have you check off every adjective in the dictionary that is you, and let's say you check off 3,000 adjectives. That's a personality evaluation of you, David. The reason we try to make them simpler and boil them down to fewer numbers is because if I was looking at David's list of 3,000 traits and Sandeep's list of 3,000 traits, it would be hard for me to compare the two people. Do you see what I mean, David? On the other hand, if there's only one personality trait, are you extroverted or introverted, then it's easier to compare people. So that's a great question, David. The more traits I have, the more detailed I can describe exactly who you are, how no one is like you. But the fewer traits I have, the easier it is for me to make comparisons. How are some people like you and some people not like you? I hope that makes sense, David. Okay. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of self-report style tests that are used in clinical settings to diagnose psychological disorders, in business settings to decide who you're going to hire, and in court settings to decide who gets the death penalty and who doesn't get the death penalty. Okay, so there are tests to measure what we call typical personalities. There's the Big Five test and the Myers-Briggs test, and those are generally designed to measure normal personalities. But then there are some people who have problematic personalities. You may be an antisocial personality. You may be a paranoid personality. You may be a narcissistic personality. There are tests designed just to find out if you have this extreme personality style. the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, the MMPI. There are even tests that evaluate qualities of the self. So there's this thing called the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. I can measure how good you feel about yourself. And then there are tests that evaluate psychological disorders. Are you bipolar? Are you anxious? Are you schizophrenic? And the one I pointed out for you is the BDI, the Beck's Depression Inventory, that can tell us if you're depression. These are all self-report tests. And some of them have, like the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Inventory, it only has 10 questions, and you answer 10 questions. The MMPI has 567 questions, but they're all self-report questions where you respond by saying, yes, this is me, no, this is not me, or this is me to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, right? A couple examples. Some of these tests are built based on a theory. So Hans Eysenck, way back a long time ago, looked at the brain circuits and built a personality that he thought measured how these different circuits in the brain work. So your reticular system is your arousal system and tells us how much stimulation you like. So we can know if you're an extroversion or an introversion, can let us know how your reticular system is working. Your emotional stability. We talked about emotions and the amygdala. Some people are very emotional and other people are not emotional at all. He argued that that can be related to your limbic system. And then we have a reward system in our brain, and some people are willing to take risks to gratify themselves than are others. So what you can do is you can think about, some tests are designed to measure a theory of how we think the personality works. But the big five is what we would call a data-driven approach. And what we do is we take David Daughtry's approach. The first thing I'm going to do is ask you 1,000 questions, David, to find out how you respond in 1,000 different situations. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a statistical technique called factor analysis to say, okay, if I measure 100 people, the people who answer yes, I do, number one, what are the other questions that they also say they do? So we try to figure out what items cluster together. Does that make sense? And then what I do is I go in and I try to figure out what those clusters mean. All right. And so the big five factor analysis personality test was done just like that. They asked people, thousands of people, they asked them 100 questions. And then what they did is they used factor analysis to see which groups of questions tended to be answered the same by individual people. And then the psychologist said, well, what personality trait are those questions related to? And what they realized is that human beings seem to have 5 basic personality orientations: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. If you're looking for a mnemonic, a memory clue to help you remember these things, just remember personality is an ocean. OCEAN. Okay. Now, this test is so popular that there are many versions like it, the paid versions and lots of free versions. I don't know if you know, but psychologists have even asked the question, do dogs have 5 factors of personality? And so what they'll do is they'll give the big 5 test to dog owners and have them describe their dogs. And analysis of that has shown that dogs have 4 factors of personality, not 5 factors of personality, right? And so the idea behind these tests is that we can measure people's personality styles. Now, quickly, we are running out of time. Today, we've talked about whether or not people are inherently good or inherently bad. And personality tests are generally thought of as things that measure inherent personality qualities, whether you're good, whether you're bad. Now, we might ask whether or not these things are inherent, and we can figure that out by doing behavioral genetic studies. We can do twin studies, and we can do adoption studies. And if we see similarity in people who are genetically related in the twin studies, then we can say that personality is genetic, it's inborn into you. On the other hand, if we do adoption studies and we find out that people who don't share any genetic material but are adopted are more similar than other people, then we might say that the environment creates people's personality. So, David, are people tabula rasa, or are we born good or evil? Well, I will tell you that the research seems to suggest that there's more of a genetic component to personality than an environmental component. Whether you say people are born good or born evil, they seem to be born rather than shaped. All right. Now, the twin studies show that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins or cousins or half cousins. And that suggests that genes really play a big part. And I think the correlation is like 0.6 or 0.7. Very strong correlation. Now, here's the crazy thing. What you'll find is that twins who live apart are more similar than twins who live together. So when you're a kid, you live with your twin sibling, and then you grow up and you move away. And what they find is that twins seem to be more similar when they're not with one another. And this is sort of an environmental effect, if you will, David, because some people suggest that what twins try to do is differentiate themselves when they're together. And then they go back to their normal, who they are, their genetic set point when they're not around. Is that because of theory that we develop naturally? And yes, and this is based on the view that you are not abused. Yes. That's a great question. David asked the question, is that because of the theory that we develop naturally? Again, I would go back to Carl Rogers' belief. I would argue that most people are born to develop relatively healthy unless there is significant trauma. And the research shows that people are pretty flexible anyhow. It turns out that a lot of children that grow up with trauma still grow up to normally. Typically human development is very robust and tends towards normality. However, David, severe abuse and neglect can definitely mess up someone's personality. Okay, so, that's all I had to say about that. I am done. It is 1:56. I ran over a couple of minutes. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. Great questions, David Daughtry. Keep asking those brilliant questions. Sandeep, I love your comments and your questions as well. I really like that you bring in the international approach to this class, Sandeep. And Nalisa, you have been my biggest supporter in both the webinars and the live stream. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Okay, David Daughtry with one more question. Go for it. And he's typing it in right now. But yes, the next lecture, we're going to ask the question, are people really evil, or is it something about the situation? No problem. Thanks for coming, Sandeep. We're actually done with class. If everybody, unless you want to hear his question and my answer, you are welcome to log off. Did Freud think it men and women? Yes. Freud. No problem. Thank you very much. Wow. You know what? Freud basically, he suggested that female sexuality was sort of a limited version of male sexuality. He's been called incredibly sexist. His theories were built to describe male functioning. They're couched in terms that describe how males function. When people pointed out the fact that he was leaving out half the sexes, he kind of went back and added in things to sort of address these limitations. But Freud sort of suggested, and he argued that they have different desires. Men have desires for sexual conquest, and he argued that I can't believe I'm saying this. He argued that females realize early in life that they don't have penises. They look down and they notice that they don't have a penis and that little boys do. And he argued in their young mind they don't understand why, and so they get jealous. He called this penis envy. And he argued that penis envy drove women to want babies. Why is it that females seem to be more interested in having children than do males? You look at married couples, usually the woman is more interested in that. Maybe it used to be this way. And he argued that for a woman, a baby represented a symbolic penis. It was like them getting this thing that they didn't have. Now, crazy, crazy, crazy. I didn't mention this in the lecture because I don't think it should be put into your brain as psychology. But Freud thought that men also noticed that they had penises that then women didn't, but they responded differently. They believed in their infantile mind that the females had done something wrong and had their penis castrated. He called this castration anxiety. And he argued that little boys were so afraid of having their penis castrated that this is what created that superego. Remember, I told you it was from this shame early in life, and I didn't really talk about what that shame was. According to Sigmund Freud, the little boy begins to develop romantic or sexual attractions towards his mother, okay, the Oedipal complex, and realizes that that is a shameful, embarrassing thing and is afraid that he's going to have his penis cut off. And so he argued that castration anxiety actually created a sense of morality. And so according to Sigmund Freud, men would have a more developed, highly developed sense of morality because of the penis that they have. Great. I've actually read a couple of books on Freud, and honestly, he might have almost been a sociopath. He was initially ripped as being a fraud and a freak, and most of the scientific community did not accept Freud. However, he worked really hard and had a group of acolytes, assistants, that helped him spread the word, and he became internationally famous as a pop psychologist. So his colleagues thought he was ridiculous, but everybody else in America who read stuff, just like you might see a TikTok or something on Instagram, he became a pop hero. Now, a lot of his stuff is ridiculous, but I think the fact that people are driven by conflict is still accepted. Therapeutic psychologists definitely believe that people have defense mechanisms and work to fix people's defense mechanisms. And we do know that some of the deepest rooted psychological problems occur because people can't deal with painful subjects. I don't know if you folks just saw this in the news, but in the United States, they are getting ready to legalize MDMA, ecstasy, for use in therapeutic situations, because it turns out that when people take ecstasy, their defenses break down and they are able to talk about the things that really, really, really hurt them and get over these pains. So ecstasy enhanced psychotherapy is a thing. It actually was a thing back in the 1950s before the hippies got a hold of LSD and ruined it for the rest of us. LSD and MDMA have been shown to be very effective in treating people with severe alcoholism that doesn't respond to any other sort of psychotherapeutic treatment. Okay then. Thanks for those great questions. Well, I tell you what, if you can come to webinar on Wednesday night in the class, I'd be more than happy to answer, but otherwise just keep shooting me questions. And if you want to meet online, and Sandeep, I'll find a way to meet you. If you want to meet personally in some meeting software and chat and ask questions, I am more than willing to do that anytime. But otherwise, I'm going to log off because I've got papers to grade, okay? You folks have a great day. Take care, and I will see you next time.